And that was the Greens leader, Senator Christine Milne, talking about today's evidence at a Parliamentary Senate Estimates Committee from the Treasury Secretary, Dr Martin Parkinson, on the issue of increasing the debt ceiling. Not long before that was the Shadow Treasurer, Chris Bowen. Both are saying their minds have not been changed by the evidence, to agree to the government's move to increase the debt ceiling from $300 to $500 billion. Joining me in the studio now is our regular panel, Greens Senator Lee Rhiannon and Parliamentary Secretary Josh Frydenberg. Welcome to you both.
Nice to be here, Lee.
This is usually a foreign affairs panel, which we'll get to in a minute, but we'll talk about the debt first. Josh, you don't yet have the agreement of either the Labor Party or the Greens to increase the debt ceiling. The issue will come back to the Senate the week after next. In the end, might you have to accept the compromise position, the increase to $400 rather than $500 billion?
Look, we are certainly hoping we get the $500 billion debt ceiling through the Parliament. And let's remind your viewers, Lyndall, that this is not the government's debt, this was Labor's debt. We were bequeathed $300 billion of debt and climbing. If you look internationally, both in the United States and Europe, there are some cold economic winds. We saw the standoff in the US Congress between Republicans and Democrats about lifting the debt ceiling. We don't want that level of uncertainty here in Australia. And what Martin Parkinson said today to the Senate estimates was that it would be prudent to lift the debt ceiling, and that it would also be useful to have a buffer, which the Office of Financial Management suggested there should be. So taking that all into account, we think $500 billion is the right number.
Lee, Dr Parkinson did use the example of what had happened in the United States, not necessarily saying it would happen in Australia, but effectively saying that international investors look at these debates and they get a bit nervous. If the debt limit is going to have to be increased beyond $400 billion anyway, why not do it now, do it once and get it out of the way?
Well, the testimony has been really quite clear today, and all the coalition would need to do, because the evidence is there right now that it needs to go to $500 billion, is to come back to Parliament at some later stage and put their case, because the case has not been established now. And with regard to the international situation and what happened in the United States, that really should be a warning to the coalition, because they're the ones who are creating the scare around the debt. Because let's remember, this week they've actually wound up some important revenue measures when they've moved on the mining tax. So we have to bring those threads together.
Josh, the government hasn't yet released MyEFO, the Mid-Year Economic and Fiscal Outlook. Why not release that to provide the evidence to back your case?
Well, the evidence is there today from Martin Parkinson, Lyndall, and the point is
Not the $500 billion, though, Josh.
He actually said that the debt is rising up to $370 billion, that it's prudent to have that $50 to $60 billion worth of buffer, and that, he said, would be based on a very optimistic outlook of the economy. And we know that there are some cold winds. And now Lee is wrong to suggest that by cutting the mining tax we are taking away revenue. In fact, the mining tax has only produced $400 million worth of revenue, but there's been over $10 billion worth of spending, far more than that. And so money has been spent on the basis of revenue that has not come in. And that's why the mining tax has to go.
Well, we've got a bit of Martin Parkinson's evidence to the Senate estimates to play. Here's what he had to say.
The choice of a $500 billion limit seems prudent if we to place a premium on ensuring financial market confidence. Were we to settle on a debt limit that was less than the anticipated prudent amount, it would be entirely reasonable for financial market participants here and overseas to wonder what might happen when what was clearly inevitable on current pathways came to occur.
Now, Lee, Martin Parkinson did say the debt was going to increase over time. He did say that nominal GDP is expected to be lower, growth is expected to be lower, and revenues are still not meeting forecasts. Doesn't that tell you that over time the debt limit's going to have to go up? And I'll put the question to you I put before. If it's going to be needed anyway, why not just do it once?
Well, I think if you listen to all of the testimony, the case wasn't established why we need to go to a $500 billion debt ceiling. And there's nothing wrong with coming back to Parliament. And again, it's how you manage debt, how you manage the economy. And going back to Josh's previous point about the revenue, part of the problem with the mining tax is that we ended up with a weaker form of it. We could have had much more revenue. We're talking about revenue coming into the government coffers, into the public coffers, and that was damaged because of what happened with the mining tax. This is a conversation about revenue that needs to come into the conversation about debt.
Josh, the need to go to Parliament to increase the debt ceiling has only been part of the legislative agenda since 2008. Why do we need it? Is there any thought of scrapping it and going back to the system that used to exist?
Well, the great irony, Lyndall, was it was introduced by the Labor Party, and there was a $75 billion debt ceiling, then a $200 billion debt ceiling, then a $250, then a $300, and the government didn't get the Parliament's support for increasing that previously. Look, I think governments see that as a measure to maintain some sort of rigour around the process. There are some who said, let's get rid of the debt ceiling altogether. But the point is, we do not want to put Australia in a position that our friends in the United States found themselves in, and we do not want greater economic certainty at a time when there are some difficulties in the economy. So this is a prudent measure, and that's Martin Parkinson's words.
We might move on now to Australia's relations with Indonesia. The Indonesian President, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, is having a press conference right at this moment. Our Indonesia correspondent George Roberts is there, and he's saying that President Yudhoyono has announced that Indonesia is suspending military cooperation with Australia on people smuggling. Josh, we heard earlier today that Indonesia was going to downgrade its relationship with Australia, but we didn't know what that would entail. This is a sign of that, isn't it?
Look, this is a very difficult issue between the two countries, but Tony Abbott said exactly the right thing when he went to Parliament on this issue and said, look, we do not comment on the specific nature of intelligence matters. That's not a coalition position, that's been a bipartisan tradition in an Australian foreign policy and intelligence matters. The other thing he said, Lyndall, was that all governments right around the world collect information, and they do that to protect their own people and to support their allies and friends. And we understand the importance of the Indonesia-Australia relationship. We don't want to do anything to jeopardise that. And I'm very confident that things will calm down and the relationship will go from strength to strength over time.
Indeed, there have been reports over the years about Australia spying on Indonesia and about Indonesia spying on Australia. Isn't, though, the problem that Australia's response is to some extent governed by how Indonesia reacts to it?
No, I mean, look, this is an issue which is, playing into the media in Indonesia, and you've heard some strong comments from Martin Natalegawa, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, and also the President. Look, Australia understands how important the relationship with Indonesia. I believe Indonesia understands how important the relationship with Australia. And if you look at the past relationship, we had real difficult times over East Timor, for example, but we were able to work through that. And look at the cooperation on the security side post-Bali bombing. It's been just wonderful, where we've built each other's capacity. On the trade relationship, there are more than 14,000 Indonesian students studying in Australia. There are much bigger interests at play here, mutual interests, and I'm very confident that the relationship will get back to an even keel over time.
Lee, Australia's just been through an election, and these allegations are from when the revelations are from when Labor was in power. Indonesia's about to face elections, including presidential elections. How much of Indonesia's response should be seen through the prism of its own domestic politics?
Oh, I imagine that that's a very big factor, but we're Australians, we're parliamentarians, and we have a responsibility to examine what has happened here. And firstly, with regard to Josh's comments, he naturally has been very kind to his Prime Minister. He said he commented on the situation. I mean, really, it was a brush-off, the way he has handled the Indonesian situation, and that isn't good for rebuilding the relationship. And we really could take a leaf out of how President Obama handled the situation with spying spying his country, spying on Germany, where he did give an apology quite quickly.
That's not clear that he actually apologised. There's, I think, a report come from the German side, but not from the American side. He did give a commitment that they wouldn't do it again.
I don't think he apologised even.
Well, there's been the reports from Germany that he apologised, and certainly there was the commitment that it wouldn't be done again. But there does need to be that clear statement of drawing the line in the sand if the relationship is to improve.
But the Greens in the past haven't been afraid of criticising Indonesia quite strongly over things like the live cattle trade, over West Papua. Why are you worried about Indonesia's response on this issue?
Well, and we will continue to raise those issues, but the diplomatic relations, there is a complexity to them. And clearly, particularly when it's one's own neighbour, you still want to have that close communication, and at the moment that's clearly been set back, as we've heard from the President's own press conference at the moment. But what this also opens up is how our spy agencies are working, because let's remember how this story that broke this week about Australia spying on the Indonesian President and his wife came about. It was because that information was shared with the US spy agency, and then that's what Mr. Snowden has released. So in the name of, remember, spying is supposed to make Australia more secure, but in fact it's actually undermining our security, our diplomatic relations, how we're sharing it with another country, and the leaks that are occurring. So what I go back to, I think we need to go back to the need for an inquiry into the overreach of spy agencies in this country.
Josh, sharing information, particularly with close allies, is not unusual, is it?
Absolutely common course.
Do we have any recourse, though? Does Australia have any recourse to speak to the United States about the fact that this information was leaked?
Well, look, the Snowden revelations and also those that related to WikiLeaks, I believe, are extremely damaging. And in fact, the head of MI6, Lyndall, said to a parliamentary inquiry in the United Kingdom that the ones who are rubbing their hands with glee are the enemies of the United Kingdom and the United States. In fact, Al-Qaeda are the ones who are the great beneficiaries of this. So let's not be under any illusions. While it may make good copy and sell a few newspapers and be good for a discussion on a talk show, this is very damaging to the national interests of Australia and to our friends and our allies.
Lee, on the broader issue of the revelations from both Edward Snowden and also from WikiLeaks, it's only information that comes from America and by its association Australia. It's not information from other countries, so we don't know necessarily what other countries are doing, isn't it? We're only seeing a small part of the international picture.
Yes, we are. And going back to Josh's point about, he's obviously critical of Mr. Snowden, but there is a serious problem with how these security agencies are working. He raises Al-Qaeda and terrorist organisations, but with this huge amount of data that is now out there, the prison controversy, these latest scandals that have broken, who knows where all this intelligence is reaching, because there is just a subservience from Australia, how we work with the US spy agencies, and there is an overreach by all these agencies. This needs to be discussed.
We might move on to the issue of information collecting a little closer to home. We were hearing an interview before Christine Milne stepped up with Nick Xenophon, and we will put that whole interview up online. The Federal Police Commissioner has confirmed a number of MPs have been subject to orders to obtain their communications records. Josh, do you know if you've ever been under surveillance? Had your phone tapped?
I have no idea about that, but in terms of those particular issues that Nick Xenophon has raised, they are reported in the Attorney General's annual report. Whatever actions have been taken by the Federal Police have been done so in accordance with the law.
Now we might just go now. We have a snippet of the press conference from the Indonesian President, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. It is a little difficult to understand, but as we heard earlier, he's announced Indonesia is suspending cooperation over people smuggling.
Saya tahu
I know
rakyat
the people
Indonesia
of Indonesia
kesal
are very
dan
annoyed
marah
and they're
terhadap
very angry.
apa yang
To what
dilakukan oleh pihak-pihak Australia
Parties
kepada
in Australia
Indonesia, kepada negara
Indonesia
kita.
towards our country.
And that was the Indonesian President. No doubt we will get more of that press conference through on ABC News 24 as the evening progresses. Lee, we were talking about the issue of politicians' phones being monitored, or at least the metadata from that. Do you know if you've ever been your phone's ever been tapped?
I don't know if it's ever been tapped, but my ASIO file suggests that, which started when I was 8 years old, actually, which I again think highlights that ASIO isn't an organisation that works for the security of the country, but vested interests. And I think...
On what do you base that allegation?
Well, I think if you look at the history of the organisation, and that they have been very one-sided in who they spy on. They really spied on the progressive side of Australian society, and right now what we've heard from Mr Negus, the head of Australian Federal Police, is that he hasn't ruled out that they're listening to MPs' phone conversations, but there's no explanation.
It was more collecting the metadata, wasn't it? Not necessarily listening to the content.
Yes, but the report that I read, that he didn't rule out that they could also be listening to phone conversations. It was certainly the metadata.
Can I just say that's a real slight on the hard-working men and women of the Australian intelligence agencies. Look, Lyndall, let's make no apologies for our intelligence and security apparatus. They have been very successful in preventing, both in Australia and globally, a repeat of the horrific events of 9/11. And that is something that we can thank the people who work in those intelligence agencies for.
And that's where we'll have to leave it. Josh Frydenberg and Lee Rhiannon, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Lyndall. Thanks, Josh.
And that is Capitol Hill for this evening. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. Until then, good night.